Travis had not only enjoyed his last lesson about belief, but he felt that the lesson was perhaps one of the more important ones he had received from Tiber. It turned out that belief was not simply something you did or did not do, it was a necessary action you needed to implement to evolve into the soul you wanted and needed to become. Travis thought about the subject of belief long after the lesson had ended. He knew that the lessons he received from Tiber were to prepare him for something to become, but he was never told when or what that something was to be. Tiber said patience had a value, but he didn't say what that value was. Perhaps Travis would remember to ask him about this during a future spiritual class. However, other more pressing questions were emerging in Travis' mind. He had been taken on a few spiritual timeline ventures by Tiber, and they were genuinely fantastic for a multitude of reasons. Not only were they unique and unlike any trips that could be experienced in this physically obstructed realm, they seemed to register in our minds better than our earthly sojourns do. It is probably because these trips were likely being taken. After all, they connect you with yourself in many different ways. The experiences we have here in this physical realm are shared by others, distorting our perception. When you travel within the spiritual timeline, your focus and understanding are entirely different. Individual perception during those trips is spiritually created and enhanced for your review. Travis and his family were still at his grandparents' cabin in the Catskills. This is where he first met Tiber. He had transformed from being a mountain lion into a human professor to meet Travis and then did it again for his last lesson on belief. It was his habit to walk through the forest to absorb and be absorbed by nature. He loved these walks as they often resulted in other beautiful things, such as coming across Tiber in disguise. But he has recently learned not to push his desires in that regard. Tiber would appear when and only when he wanted to appear and not before he was ready to do so. And so, Travis simply concentrated on the natural elements that made up this forest and lake environment as he meandered through the area. The visual treats were obvious, but the subtle scents and faint sounds were not as apparent until a person decided to focus on explicitly hearing and sensing them. At first, Travis did just that and was nearly overwhelmed by the intensity of the results he experienced. He glanced at a dense packet of green plants merged to form one ill-defined green shrubbery mass. He suddenly became aware of each plant in that group that was now demonstrating as an individual. Then, ever so gradually, each of those individual plants began to present its uniqueness. As Travis stayed focused on each plant, he observed that each leaf demonstrated a vibratory existence that promoted life and purpose. He knew this was simply a shift in perception when watching something, but it made a big difference. Travis could be content seeing a non-specific grouping of plants only and then go on his way. Or he could realize the individuality within the vegetative world and then decide what to do with this newly acquired information. A little thing can become a huge thing only because of a change in perception followed by a commitment to understanding the validity of creation. Then he saw something moving out of the corner of his eye. It was a flurry of wings landing on a nearby fallen tree trunk. He glanced to see a large barred owl with its claws wrapped around a branch protruding on the large tree trunk. The owl was primarily gray with brown stripes. Its large eyes were peering out of a face surrounded by a darker brown circle of tufted feathers. The bird was still but staring at Travis very intently. Travis moved closer and bent over to look at the owl, suddenly letting out an impossibly large hoot. Travis quickly jumped back, almost falling to the ground when this occurred. Then the owl shivered, fluffed its feathers, and resettled on the limb. The owl then said,
"Got you, my favorite student. You are finally here. I was wondering when you would show up for your lesson. I don't have all that much spare time, as you know."
That is absolutely nuts. You have taught me in previous lessons that there is no such thing as time, particularly when dealing with spiritual stuff. You have all the time in the world, even if that is an irrelevant statement on my part.
Well, my boy, I'm glad you have learned something from our past lessons. Now I suppose you want me to pop out of this beautiful owl and change into a professor's human form.
You got it, Professor, for an old man at least. But it's really bizarre to hear human speak coming out of a bird's beak. You look quite wise in an owl's form, but don't sound wise.
Then the barred owl shrugged and transformed into a bright shimmering golden bubble. Within a millisecond, the bubble became more solid in appearance and began to transform itself into a human form. Then it quickly solidified, and a fully clothed human male was sitting on the fallen tree's trunk near where the owl had been perched. A man appeared dressed in khaki trousers and a perfectly ironed military-style khaki shirt. He was a decidedly handsome middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair. He wore a golden brown fox men's mock-toe wedge leather boot with a belt to match. Travis surveyed him and nodded his approval. he said.
Tiber, you are marvelous. Each time you arrive for these lessons, you look quite different but always have the essence of Tiber, my fantastic professor. How do you do it?
Getting into a character's persona is one of my favorite things about sliding into the obstructive realms to provide these lessons. It's a form of play acting that I truly enjoy. I get to wear interesting clothes and experience being in the consciousness of all manner of creatures before I take on the professor's image and attitude. I think you really like it as well.
I do. Although sometimes you really irritate me before you get around to amazing me. It's an okay trade-off though.
Thank you, Travis. I love you too. Now, what is the lesson you are going to request today? I hope I have dressed appropriately for the subject matter, but if not, I can change in a rapid instant.
You are dressed perfectly. Because today, I want to know all about adventure. Specifically, if adventures are important to our evolutionary growth, how should I prepare my mindset for those occasions when we embark on adventures?
As you have learned from our previous lessons, anything you know or experience, either mentally or physically, is essential to everyone's plan for evolutionary growth. So obviously, the answer to your question is yes. Any adventure of any kind, good or bad, exciting or bland, good or evil, etc., is worthy of your efforts. We only serve time in this or other obstructive realms to acquire experiences. It is the reason we were made by Supreme Consciousness.
That is wonderful. I was hoping you would confirm that concept for me because I love the adventure of any kind. When can we start one?
An adventure can be started within any moment you wish. Remember the definition though. An adventure may well be an unusual or exciting experience, alone or with others. It could be an undertaking of questionable nature or achieving quests of positive or perhaps even adverse outcomes. It may be hazardous or beneficial according to the plans or perhaps because of the lack of one, resulting in the haphazardness of activities. Here is another thing to remember. Don't confuse an adventure with a journey, which is simply the act of traveling from one place to another. They are entirely different dogs. Both will have value to you, but a journey relates to simple locational movement, whereas an adventure should involve the traveler much more. Any adventure must result in the idea that you will actually move forward in your evolutionary progress by experiencing something. Perhaps an adventure will progress slowly, but you should never allow yourself to go backward. For the adventure to have significant value, you must progress forward in an experience as much as possible. Got it?
Got it.
Tiber and Travis then walked to the high escarpment that overlooked the lake. The sun was high overhead, and the lake's surface was radiating petite sparkling starlets created from the light breezes caressing the surface of the water. Travis turned to look at Tiber and remarked about the beauty of this scene they were looking at.
It certainly is, but this vista and other natural scenes also represent many additional attributes. They can provide an inspirational boost that will urge you to see this earthly realm from an entirely different perspective. When you concentrate on them, they offer ongoing proof of the reality of divine creativity. And the more you offer yourself up to it, the more convinced you are of your part in it. You are encouraged to use these scenes as a springboard to spiritual immersion in the essence of these creative concepts.
Wow. That is kinda a heavy thought. Could you downsize it a bit for my pea brain to absorb?
Sure. I don't believe you need to have a simplified explanation for that pea brain of yours, but here it is anyway. First, something you might look at or think about grabs your attention. This is an essential first step, by the way. Next, you concentrate on that subject matter to allow your consciousness to adequately connect with and realize that you are truly interested in it. Then, you use your imagination to connect the subject with another similar subject you might want to investigate. In this case, the strength of the lake view we see here makes me wonder what this location was like during prehistoric times. This desire sends me, or in this case, us to that time.
Travis was thunderstruck when he saw the lake they had been viewing had become a much larger body of water with very different vegetation surrounding it. There wasn't much variety or contrast in the surrounding greenery, and the overall impression was that the shrub and tree varieties were far stiffer and less colorful in appearance than what you saw in the current-day Catskills. This was a much sterner environment, and the horticulture reflected that. Tiber informed Travis that traveling within the spiritual timeline was all-encompassing when searching for experiences and answers. For example, even though they were non-physical spirits visiting a physical time frame, the timeline allows you to avoid or sample some physical aspects of the site when you are there. Tiber then requested some adjustments for them, and Travis was immediately accosted with immense heat and humidity that was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The odors were dramatic, foreign, and overwhelming. The timeline allowed travelers to maintain the physical adjustments they were used to and experience the physical aspects of the place they were visiting. And just like a switch, the timeline could simply adjust the traveler to the appropriate comparisons. If these adjustments had not been available, a traveler could not readily absorb and tolerate the specific experiences they needed to acquire for any exploratory trip. The reality of the many specific timeline frames might overwhelm a traveler if these adjustments were not permitted or granted. Tiber arranged for a switch back to tolerable, reached over to touch Travis' arm, and pointed to the far left. Travis saw giant animals moving about on the high ground above the lake. Also, others were drinking on the water's edge. They were all dinosaurs of various kinds. Travis recognized the Stegosaurus on the bank of the lake. The ones higher up on a hill were predators he recognized as velociraptors, and he counted about 7 of them. Travis knew from his school studies that he and Tiber must have been observing this scene from around 245 to 66 million years ago. He glanced at the professor and asked him to confirm his thoughts. Tiber simply nodded and said,
To be exact, we are standing here 125 million years from our time. Pretty impressive, don't you think?
Travis nodded his head in agreement and then replied,
Absolutely.
He had always found the Mesozoic era and its big-ass dinosaurs to be one of his favorite mental images to enjoy, and he was actually seeing them alive. 2 pterodactyls suddenly flew overhead. They seemed to be heading toward the lake where the other dinosaurs were currently hanging out. It appears that curiosity was a feature that these animals had embedded into their brains. They would likely decide what they wanted to do when they got to that location. They were not large enough to attack anything that Travis and Tiber could see, and they appeared much more minor than Travis had seen portrayed in the Jurassic Park movies. Actually, they reminded Travis more of our modern-day pelicans than anything else. It quickly became apparent that the pterodactyls were after fish when they approached the lake's surface. They promptly scooped their bills into the water, grabbing fish swimming near the surface. Indeed, they were very much like our pelicans. They both sat down on a large gray boulder and continued to watch the many dinosaurs cavorting at the lake for a couple of hours. Many other animals came and went during that time, and it was apparent that this lake was famous to all of them. Tiber then turned to Travis and asked him if he was ready to go to the next stage of this lesson. Travis simply nodded yes to the question and immediately found that he was at a lakefront like the one they had just visited and yet not like that lake. Travis knew they were far advanced in chronological time and was aware that time seemed to affect everything because it was designed that way. However, he was aware that time didn't exactly exist, but the change was brought about by all action, which created and enhanced the image and sense that time had changed and perhaps was the cause of change. In any event, this lake was bluer in color, and the vegetation surrounding it was more like that seen in our era, although here, again, it was not quite the same. The plant material had more shades of green and considerably more contrast, tones, and textures. It was also far more tropical in appearance than the trees and shrubs now to be found in the Catskill Mountains. Travis continued to look around in all directions, waiting for a clue as to why they were there. He decided to look at Tiber to acquire that clue. Tiber responded by saying,
This is approximately 2 million years into our past, and human manifestation began to appear here and there. It was not an accident, but it was gradual. Supreme consciousness created duplicates of itself and wanted to use the obstructed realms, such as Earth, to nurture and educate sentient creatures within the obstructed natures that such realms, or other obstructed realms, provide.
Travis and Tiber walked along a natural pathway composed of crushed seashells along a dense tropical fringe of foliage along the lakefront. They were, of course, not visible to any living entities in this realm, whereas they were free to observe anything in the area. It wasn't long before they saw some humanoid-appearing animals doing something along the lake's edge. They were covered with a considerable amount of hair, but not as much as apes or monkeys and modern-day simians. It was easy to determine the male from the female because of their appearance and mannerisms. They had 2 small humanoid children with them, but Travis couldn't tell what sex they were, probably because of their lack of maturity. Obviously, this family was attempting to catch something on the water's edge. As Travis and Tiber came closer to them, they saw that they were using their hands to corral fish within a larger grouping of rocks submerged in the water. This would allow them to grab the fish trapped within the rock's enclosure. Once they had the fish safely in place, they poked their fingers inside the fish's mouth and then pulled the fish out of the water. They then bit the fish behind the head to kill it and threw it onto the ground, where they would await dinner. Travis turned to Tiber and suggested,
"These animals are the real reason we are on this timeline adventure, isn't it?"
You are, of course, absolutely right. This human-like family is the physical ancestors of all of us that will eventually experience lives within this earthly obstructed realm from this point on. They were created by our Creator and monitored and guided by spiritual guides that we call angels or zenithians, or often known by many other names in untold cultures throughout human times.
Amazing! I am beyond thrilled to meet them here in this prehistoric place. But I am also amazed that I feel a strong emotional connection with them. I don't have to do or say anything while in their presence. I understand with some basic instinct that they are me, and I am them.
I knew you would absorb all this correctly, for this is why we exist in the first place. Before the general animal instinct was replaced by the human form of introspective sentience, these humanoids were born to experience life at a lower instinctual level. They acted, reacted, and then learned to improve on their reactions. They improved or perished. Instinctual life was simple and effective, but it didn't promote much in the way of physical or spiritual evolution.
Tiber, what are the immediate changes that were made in these humanoids, and what was specifically the intention of Supreme Consciousness in creating mankind? I know you discussed some of this in previous lessons, but I would like to hear it again while we observe these particular prototypes in this specific time frame.
Okay, here is the tense inversion. Supreme Consciousness decided to create duplicates of itself at the beginning of everything. And don't ask me to explain that reality, as none of us can. The problem was that anything duplicated from the Creator would obviously have all of the potentials the Creator had but with no individuality. Therefore, all new creations had to be born without recollection of where they came from. This, of course, sounds familiar because all of our babies are born with the same disadvantage. No memory, but plenty of capability to learn from and understand what they were experiencing and going to experience. It is the beginning of a grand adventure in every instance.
Travis was carefully listening to this information, and although nothing was really new to him, the importance of it was penetrating. He glanced over to the hominid family fishing on the bank of the lake. Suddenly, an enormous bear-like creature came tearing out of the forest and rushing toward the hominid family. The noise made by the bear breaking through the dried branches within the vegetative border alerted the family. They looked up to see the predator heading for them at breakneck speed. Immediately, the children ran to the female animal for protection. She was already bending down to pick up the largest stones she could hurl at the oncoming bear. The male hominid also picked up some rocks and started throwing them directly at the oncoming bear. Then the female and youngsters and the male moved apart from each other to confuse the bear by making his target less clear. They were all roaring as loud as they could the entire time. Even the young hominid started to pick up and throw rocks at the bear, who was becoming more confused by the second, at these prey who resisted him rather than running from him, which most prey did. The male hominid saw a large, sturdy branch lying near him and bent down to pick it up. Then he quickly stood up and raised this newfound cudgel high in the air. He promptly ran at the bear while making a series of roaring sounds. The female was lobbing numerous large stones at the bear simultaneously, and the youngsters were contributing a considerable amount of screaming noises to this family's defensive efforts. The bear suddenly halted his advance and stood up to present an extensive and impressively dangerous appearance. He also provided a deafening roar that seemed to shake the ground, but the male hominid did not stop his advance, and he swung the cudgel in a wide arc while leaping high in the air. The sturdy cudgel hit the bear on his head just above the eyes. It shocked him, and he immediately dropped to his feet and shook his head in disbelief. The bear's hesitation allowed the male hominid to land another blow to the top of his head, which was all the bear needed. The bear turned around and headed back to the jungle as fast as his legs and throbbing head would allow. Watching this scene, Travis was terrified to see this dangerous natural scene unfurling before his eyes. He turned to see Tiber smiling at him as he said,
"This bear is known to our scientists as the giant shirt-faced bear of the Pleistocene epoch, and it was a significant predator of the time. But our primary point of interest here is the capabilities demonstrated by the soon-to-be humans. They were acting out of animal instinct and a learned or calculated defense structure. Let's analyze what we saw in this scene. When the bear first attacked our hominid family, they reacted with typical and to be expected instinctive defensive actions. The youngsters fled to the mother for protection, and then they all started to yell or roar to scare something off. Then each hominid picked up rocks to throw at the danger. Even children will instinctively know to do this, but to elect to throw rocks defensively instead of fleeing starts to elevate their defensive strategy from an instinctive act to a calculated one. All this is a normal instinct for most animals to this point. But most interesting was that the hominid targets started to create space between each other to throw off the bears, focusing on a single combined target. And then, the male hominid sees a potential weapon on the ground and picks it up. Even while tossing rocks at the enemy, he quickly stands to his full height and holds the cudgel high in the air, elevating his stature from both his and the bear's perspectives. The bear probably begins to lose confidence that he is the most dominant combatant in this conflict, and when the male hominid whacks him on the head with a weapon, not just once but twice, the bear decides to retreat. It had become evident that this was not a battle between enemies that was being fought by instinct alone. Can you see all of this?
I do. And I also believe that you wanted me to see all of this so I could better understand what we as souls have evolved from and, most probably, from this point in the evolution, what we want to evolve into. Is that correct?
To a degree, but as with any new concept, particularly this most complicated and important one, it is difficult to get it exactly right. But you are heading in the right direction. But let's jump to the next segment of this big adventure.
It hardly seemed that Travis had blinked his eyes while staring at the strange scenery. He had expected to see the lake that had been a significant part of the past lessons, but this place was entirely different. Travis turned to take in the entire sight and slowly began to realize that he was not on Earth. This had to be an alien planet altogether, and then suddenly, that idea was confirmed when he saw two different sized suns in nearby positions in the lower sky. And in place of the blue sky he was used to, it appeared to be more aquamarine in color. Tiber informed Travis that he was correct in assuming they were on a different planet than Earth. The planet's name was not pronounceable in English or any other Earth language, primarily because there was no verbal or spoken language on this planet. Everyone was telepathic, so if you requested identification of this planet, you would receive a mental image or images defining the planet in a cognitive response. It's a very efficient method of communication once you get used to it. Tiber then used mental telepathy to let Travis know what the planet was called, or seen, or better yet, imaged. Travis was never good with languages, and now that a speech was telepathic, he felt even more useless. He asked Tiber the reason for this visit in the first place and what would they do now that they were here. Tiber responded to both questions.
First, we are here to show you that your present concept of living and learning within an obstructed realm like Earth is not the only realm available to us. And next, I wanted to demonstrate just how different various existences could be. You saw this in Lesson 12, when we traveled to Grethardra. If you remember, we shared a life together there.
I most certainly remember that trip, and I recall a little more than I want to. My reticence in that regard had more to do with finding out that you and I were a family. You were my mother and I was your young son in that scenario. I'm still not used to the reality that relationships with other souls vary greatly throughout the reincarnation spectrum. You as an individual may be a mother, a father, a husband, a wife, or a child and then find that you can and will adopt any of those roles in future incarnations. You never know what you will be.
Tiber laughed at the comment and then said,
Actually, you do know that this is going to occur. The entire purpose of evolution through experience requires you to do all those things and many more. You must accept that role-playing makes spiritual evolution far more effective. which is essential to that goal. It's the same as being an actor as a profession in the earthly realm. The more variety in the roles you play, the better you will become as an actor. It's actually quite as simple. We had a wonderful life together on Gret Hardra, and learned much about getting along with and loving one another. We had no wars and very few personal conflicts on that planet. Their civilization hadn't progressed much up to that time, and still hasn't to this day. But it was a fine place to live, and the people were wonderful souls. I brought you there to show you that the tapestry of life, woven through its various incarnations, is unique and fabulous no matter where they occur. Now, here on this world, all things are very different from what we had on Gret Hardra or on Earth. The fact that telepathy is the only means of direct communication here has created an entirely different cultural norm. It is similar to being in the transitional realms, where no nothing physical exists, and souls merge by thought alone. However, a whole new dynamic takes place where there is no verbal or physical communication. It makes a lot of difference and alters how individuals react to one another.
I want to see what is happening here in this strange world. Where do we start?
It was only another split second, or perhaps even experienced as a non-second, and it found Tiber and Travis walking together in a very modern, at least by Earth standards, city street. They were surrounded by thousands of, here again by human standards, very strange-looking people. They were people just going about their business. Somehow, Travis could discern female from male, but oddly enough, could not really understand how he was doing it. They had heads, arms, and legs but not exactly like ours, and there seemed to be considerable variation in their skin colors, but most were gray. Their hands and feet were much more extensive than ours and considerably more expansive. They were all moving about quite gracefully, and their height was perhaps a bit taller than people on Earth. They wore no clothing, but genitals were not evidenced. He noticed that their eyes were almost 3 times as large as humans, and no ear flaps were prominent. Their noses were somewhat flat. No hair was evident anywhere on their bodies. Travis was also concerned that he did not hear conversations or sounds from those gathered there. Tiber said that was because he was not tuned into the telepathic nature of this world. Tiber then corrected that by opening the gateways within Travis's consciousness. Suddenly there was a chaotic buzzing in his brain from the mental frequency mix occurring from this enormous mass of people. He started to panic. Tiber adjusted the receiving capabilities, and Travis began to receive images within his mind. He could also single out what sounds he did or did not want to receive. He was immediately learning to focus on precisely what and who he wanted to hear or see. It was, at the same time, confusing and straightforward. He was adjusting to and getting comfortable around the populace. Travis began looking at the scenery of both a hardscape and landscape nature. The vegetation was surprisingly recognizable and yet not quite. It was like going from a temperate climate to a tropical zone on Earth. You recognized that everything was organic and a plant was a plant in both zones, but you appreciated the difference in each. Tiber explained that the various souls that had progressed from obstructed to transitional realms were assigned tasks in both of those realms as exalted entities. They were known to us as Zenithians, angels, Malachims, Devas, masters, and many other names, but they assisted in the creation and maintenance of all of the worlds that exist. Therefore, there is an essence of their creativity that is often very familiar to those other spiritual travelers like us who come visiting to visit those places. Regarding architecture and other hardscape elements, it was all quite recognizable except for the materials used to construct the buildings and, of course, significant differences in general design elements. Generally, most buildings seem pretty fluid, with rounded tops and sides. There was a lot of glass in evidence, and Travis thought perhaps over 75% of the surfaces of the building were glass. The main difference was that they seemed to radiate a beautiful brightness, each adopting its unique color that gently pulsated to some unknown vibrational rate. Travis began to realize that this exquisitely beautiful color was everywhere and seemed unusual to the element being viewed. The primary construction material seemed similar to Earth in that the building appeared to have been formed and poured with solidified liquid, but Travis couldn't be sure about that. And so, everything Travis saw was different but not totally foreign. It was as though familiar designers had created very original creations, but not any that could not be appreciated if one used an open mind when experiencing their existence. All the things that Travis was seeing and experiencing dominated his mind as they walked the streets of this impressive city. He was taking it all in and enjoying every second of it. Suddenly he was taken aback by a telepathic greeting addressed to Tiber that also spread into his mind. It registered as,
"Hello, Tiber. It's wonderful to see you again." Travis looked to the message source and saw a tall, stately male figure approaching them. Tiber replied in telepathic mode.
Hello, Zephyth. I was hoping I would see you on this trip. This young man is Travis. He's my current favorite student. He is from Earth, and I am showing him around your city and planet today.
Of course, you were hoping to see me, as I received your spiritual knock-knock as soon as you arrived here. And it's nice to meet you, Travis. I used to be Tiber's favorite student many lifetimes ago, but he's forgotten that, it seems.
They both stifled telepathic laughs. Travis was fascinated by the casual tone of this social greeting. It seemed to him that it was very unusual on a foreign planet, but upon careful thought, why shouldn't it be casual if they were indeed previous friends? Then Zephyth asked Travis,
How do you like our world so far?
I love it, Zephyth.
Travis was pleased that he could communicate what he felt to the entity he wanted it to go to exclusively. Travis simply thought and focused that thought directly to Tiber's friend. Somehow Tiber had been an outstanding teacher as usual and had embedded that trick without Travis even being aware that he now knew how to do it. After a bit of small introductory interchange, they began moving about through this fantastic world, and Travis was being treated to the best tour he had ever been on. Tiber told him that Zephyth had been his student in the past. Now Zephyth was teaching others what he had been taught. This was another example of the student becoming the teacher and then becoming the student, and on and on. Soon they were moving out of the city and into heavily forested mountains. Their movement was not precisely walking as Travis knew it, but using a movement more akin to gliding. Travis had also become aware that he and Tiber had morphed into a similar form to Zephyth. Of course, Tiber was mindful that Travis had just become aware of this and said,
I just wanted us to be more comfortable and dress better for the occasion.
Travis smiled but said nothing, but the thought that Zephyth and the other people he had been seeing had looked somewhat familiar to him since they arrived entered his mind. He had thought that thought in public without knowing it, and Zephyth caught it and answered the inquiry.
We look familiar because we have visited Earth in physical form. Our technology allows us to travel from planet to planet in this universe, and we have often been to your world on our space-traveling adventures. Although we attempted not to be observed during our visits, there were occasions when others of your kind saw us there and moved to sketch us or take photos. You have most likely seen some of them.
Travis nodded, as he had seen these representations but had not believed in them and therefore passed over the idea that Earth had visitors such as Zephyth. He told Zephyth that he remembered those incidents and did not buy into them. He said he was sorry, and Zephyth just laughed and said,
Don't apologize. We were hoping that none of you bought into it.
They continued up the mountainside, often stopping alongside watercourses that were meandering down the slopes and especially stopping at various waterfalls of every size imaginable. At least to Travis, animals of unusual description would make appearances along the trek. Most were impossibly cute by anyone's standards, and a few were impressive, even scary, but somehow one knew not to get too concerned about their arrival and not to judge them by their appearance. Shortly after that, they reached the summit of a mountain they were hiking up. It was an awe-inspiring walk, and just like the best scenic hikes on Earth, the natural pathways were full of wonder. The soil was rich with earthy fragrance and hinted at the vibrant life within it. The shrubbery was extraordinarily lush, varied in sizes and shapes, and full of the essence of life. Their flowers were very different from those of Earth, and yet, as Travis had discovered earlier, he saw familiarity with the blooms and the vegetative growth they sprung from. Travis knew they often had the same spiritual designers working on these different worlds. They were bound to borrow from the best they had found, contributed to, or perhaps even created on other planets in many realms. At the top of this particular mountain, they found themselves in a cloud bank and all of the landscape was dripping with multicolored brilliant dewdrops. Travis stopped staring at the fantastic colors the dewdrops offered for his enjoyment. Tiber mentally called to him, waving his arm to encourage him to join them. When he did, he was astounded to see one of the most magnificent views he had ever seen. Every element that combined to create a breathtaking scene were now in his sight. The air was crystal clear, enabling everything Travis saw to be exceptionally well defined. The brilliantly colorful city they had left was seen far below them in the valley and was truly spectacular. It was nestled within a verdant valley that was composed of a multitude of many mountainsides and grassy hills. A river meandering through the valley sparkled. It seemed like millions of diamonds were floating within a fluid that composed the watercourse. The blue-green color of the river was nearly identical to the aquamarine hue of the sky. As much as he enjoyed what he saw, Travis had to wonder why it looked so much more spectacular than what he saw back on Earth. As beautiful as it was, the same elements on both planets were in evidence. And as usual, Tiber had picked up on that thought, and he offered to help Travis.
You are entirely correct in your current thinking. There is very little difference between this planet and Earth, except in specific varieties of plants and animals. The primary effect you are experiencing is being able to differentiate between the heartbeats of the planets. The health of any planetary system is paramount. This planet is the result of hundreds of years of its populace caring about the environment and working to maintain or improve it. As Zephyr said, his people visited Earth many times in the past and saw what not knowing or not caring about the Earth's health meant. They dropped hints here and there to encourage Earthbounds to wake up to this fact. The people of any world must be the caretakers of that world, and Zephyr and his people have that attitude as their highest priority. I precisely wanted you to see that effect and feel it for yourself.
I do see it and feel it. Tiber and I compliment Zepathy and his people for what they have done with their home world. I will figure out what I can do in that regard with Earth as I mature. I promise you that.
Great. And with that, I will end today's adventure lesson so we don't overwhelm your teenage mind. I want you to have memories of this world and its ideals and urge you to establish a mindset that will carry over into adulthood.
Wonderful. And thank you so much, Zepathy, for being such a wonderful host. I genuinely love your world and hope we can meet again, either here or on Earth or wherever else our friend here arranges for us.
Zepate then folded his arms over his heart and then raised his hands to his lips in the form of a goodbye kiss. It was a lovely gesture. Then he said,
Goodbye, Travis. Think of me with love, as will I for you.
It would not be possible to do otherwise, Zepathy.
And then suddenly, Travis stood by a fallen tree trunk on a high escarpment overlooking the beautiful lake in the Catskills, where they had started this lesson. Travis felt something on his shoulder and turned, only to be staring into the eyes of the barred owl that he knew to be Tiber. The owl let out a loud hoot as he did at the start of this lesson, but this time Travis didn't jump but only laughed and told the owl to get. The owl fluttered its wings, flew to the fallen tree trunk, and immediately morphed into Tiber's professor form again. He then walked over to Travis, wrapped his arms around him, and said,
I love you, my boy, and I truly enjoyed our adventure this time.
Love you too, you old hoot owl, and I thank you for such a great lesson. Not only was that adventure a good one, but the experience that came with it was phenomenal. And I believe that I have learned a whole lot because of it.
Tiber then said,
Well, think of what you want for your next lesson, my boy, and I'll try to do as well as we did for this one. Until then, hang in there.
And with that, Tiber did his morphing thing and disappeared in a shimmering golden mist. Travis headed back to his family in the lake cabin. How about these adventures? I loved arriving on the spiritual timeline to planets far away in other obstructed realms and then visiting other souls during lifetimes far away and having little relationship to our time. I will tell you there will be no limit to what Tiber can introduce Travis and all of us to. There is no limit to what exists or what we can all experience. If the past episodes provide hints, we will experience many more unique adventures in future episodes. Episode number 17 is in the process of being written and recorded. If you are a member of the Emerald Crystal Warrior Club, you will automatically be alerted when that occurs. If you are not a member, consider joining the club for all announcements of anything new coming to the Emerald Crystal website. Please visit our website, theemeraldcrystal.com, to see, read, or hear more of our literary offerings. You might want to purchase our spiritual thriller novels, Quest for the Emerald Crystal Book Number 1, Spiritual Warriors in the Bahamas, or Quest for the Emerald Crystal Book Number 2, Spiritual Warriors in Belize, and Quest for the Emerald Crystal Book Number 3, Spiritual Warriors in the Caribbean, within the website or on Amazon.com.